Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another installment in ARA's webinar presentation series. My name is Natalie Curry. I'm the General Manager of Supply Chains at the ARA. And firstly, I'd like to actually begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet. For me, based in Canberra, this is the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm really pleased to introduce our webinar presenter for today, Virginia Haussegger AM, who is going to explain to us our role in generational equality. Virginia is the chair of the 50/50 by 2030 Foundation at the University of Canberra's Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis, and the chief editor of Broad Agenda, Australia's leading research-based gender equality blog. Virginia was also awarded the ACT Australian of the Year in 2019. I'm sure you're all familiar that Virginia is an award-winning journalist and social commentator with an extensive media career spanning 30 years. A passionate advocate for women's rights and gender equality, Virginia served 6 years on the board of UN Women Australia, where she hosted numerous gender equality campaigns. Virginia was actually going to be our keynote speaker at the ARA's Diversity and Rail Lunch in Sydney in March as part of our International Women's Day celebrations, that we actually unfortunately had to postpone due to a current pandemic. So I'm really pleased that we actually won't miss out on her insights and that even more people have been able to listen in on her presentation without even leaving their home offices. So what a treat. PDF slides for today's presentation are available to download under the light blue down arrow resources icon at the top right corner of your screen. This presentation is also being recorded, which you'll be sent a link to in the coming days. This is a topic that no doubt will generate a lot of questions and discussion, and so we've allowed plenty of time for that at the end of Virginia's presentation. So you can post your questions throughout the presentation just by clicking on the dark blue hand icon in the top right corner of your screen, and Virginia will seek to address these all at the end of her presentation. Just a reminder, this webinar is live and interactive, so if you're experiencing any technical issues during the webinar, please just dial the Redback support team, whose number's listed at the bottom of your page. But I don't want to hold up proceedings, so without further ado, let me welcome Virginia to the screen. Welcome, Virginia.
Thank you so much. It is an absolute delight to be here, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person. Don't we all look forward to the day when that will be the case? But this is the next best thing, and quite frankly, it's a lot of fun. So I have a lot I want to talk to you about, and I really appreciate you gathering today, those of you who have jumped online for this session. And I'm going to invite you to invite your whole family. Bring in your sons, your spouses, your daughters, your grandchildren, if they're there, because this is a discussion for all of us, every single one of us. Gender equality, generation equality, and your role is what we're going to talk about today. But I want to take you on a journey, and I want you to suspend a lot of attitudes, beliefs, perceptions you might have around gender equality. Just suspend those for the next 45 minutes or so, and let's just go on a bit of a journey, because gender equality is not an easy thing to talk about. Right at the moment, most of us think, that's okay, we've done that, we're doing really well in Australia, we've had a female Prime Minister, a female Governor-General. I actually had an article in the Canberra Times this week, I think it was yesterday, and on Broad Agenda about how I, myself, looked at the newspapers early this morning and thought, gender equality, we'll fix that. Until I really started to drill down and looked hard at the numbers that I was seeing before me. If you're interested, have a look at that article. The reality is that the progress towards gender equality that I had hoped we would have made by now. I started my journey as a feminist and as an advocate probably 30, 40 years ago. Progress I thought we'd made, we haven't. In fact, progress about gender equality and increasing the rights of women and girls in Australia and around the world has been incredibly, agonisingly slow. The head of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said when he was launching the Generation Equality campaign on International Women's Day this year, International Women's Day being the 8th of March, And the campaign is a worldwide campaign. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, a lot of the events associated with that have been cancelled, which is another reason why it's wonderful to be able to take you through some of that today. But he said at the time, gender inequality is the overwhelming injustice of our age and the biggest human rights challenge we face. Now, for some of us in Australia, we live privileged lives. We're safe, hopefully, we're secure, we're peaceful, and we feel we're pretty equal. So a comment like that seems either a little bit jarring or seems to be, not about us. That's why I want to take you on this journey. Gender equality is often confused with equity. What does it mean when we talk about gender equity? Well, in reality, we can have all the gender equality programs and policies in place and try to offer everyone a bit of support so that they can actually participate in a more equal way. But in truth, we're all, men and women, boys and girls, we're all impacted differently by different aspects of our lives. And it might be our race, it might be our religion, it might be our disability, it might be our income level, it might be poverty, as well as gender. But gender is an overriding identity. But the truth is, all of those different things impact how we can or can't participate fairly in society. So what we're really talking about when we talk about gender equality is gender equity. We want to make sure that everyone, men and women, are considered, and all those intersecting attributes of their life are taken into account when we try to support people so that they can progress and participate fully in their lives. Now, for me as a journalist, I began my journalism career in television over 35 years ago. And yes, I would like to say I was 3 years old at the time, but I wasn't. But for me, feminism and gender equality was something I attacked in stories and interviews, and it was something I tried to unpack from a policy perspective. But when I hit my late 30s, it suddenly became really super personal for me in a way I just really hadn't seen coming. I hadn't anticipated. So a lot happened, and I'm just going to shortcut that story by sharing with you a little video that was taken last year, or made when I was announced as the ACT 2019 Australian of the Year. And I was asked by the producers as to what was my story? Why did feminism matter so much to me? And this is the little story I told. So it's a very short video. Let's have a little look at that.
I think when I was young and growing up, it always baffled me that everywhere where power and authority resided, there were no women. There was such an absence of women. All those in positions of authority around me as I was a kid were men. A long time later, when I became a journalist, I wrote a very personal column. I poured out years of pent-up frustration about what I thought was a failure of feminism. I'd hit that point where I'd found in my life I'd been pushing forward with my career so hard that I hadn't stopped to allow myself the time to consider having a family or having a children. And when I did, it was too late. I'd left it too late. And I was angry that I realised women have to make a choice. We were promised we could have it all. We could have careers and families. We would be economically empowered, and we weren't. And I got really cross at all the women leaders I knew and all my feminist foremothers. And I named them and I shamed them. And boy, I get smashed for doing that. I was attacking the wrong thing. It took me years to realise what I should have been looking at was the barriers and the obstacles in workplaces, in organisations, the institutional barriers and biases, the systemic issues that were preventing women from progressing. If gender equality is to be achieved, women need to stand on the shoulders of others. And consequently, that's what I found myself doing in recent years. The work I do, the voice I use, and the support I get is as a result of standing on the shoulders of other women who've come before me.
So I'll tell you a little bit more about the work that I do a little bit later, but a video, a couple of columns that I had written that resulted in me being smashed. It was 2002, 2003. Thank God there's no social media then, because I did get smashed. But it was a really interesting experience, because not only did I go and hide under a rock for a little while, but it made me move out to the world, the bigger world, and interview a huge bunch of women about their own experiences and try and unpack what had actually happened for me. So I ended up writing a book. The book was Wonder Woman, The Myth of Having It All, and that was launched in a broadcast at the Press Club in 2005. Julia Gillard actually did the launch. I think she was the Shadow Health Minister at the time. But moving on, I want to actually go back now. So I'm backtracking a little bit. But 1995, I was a journalist, a reporter for what was then called the 7:30 Report. And I remember watching in our office then feed coming in from Beijing that was from the 4th World Women's Conference held by the United Nations in Beijing in 1995. This was the biggest gathering of women to talk about gender equality the world had ever seen. And at that particular event, every nation in the United Nations was represented. And at that particular event, a blueprint for gender equality was agreed and signed by 187 nations, Australia included. And that blueprint was called the Beijing Platform and the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Now, it was considered at the time to be revolutionary, and it was also contained a number of targets for gender equality over a number of years. And it was considered and believed, hoped, that if we actually stuck to that plan around the world, we would smash gender inequality. Well, this year marks 25 years since that blueprint was written and signed by every nation of the United Nations. And unfortunately, we're a long, long way from achieving most of what was set out in that document. It was the Beijing conference, apart from having 17,000 delegates and about 30,000 advocates who attended. It was a time when Hillary Clinton looking rather different back then, when she made that famous statement of hers, human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. Well, jumping forward now to Australia in 2014, so a year before the 20th anniversary of that document, that blueprint for gender equality, and the then head of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo-Nyaka, and I apologise to any of our African friends who might be listening. I know my pronunciation isn't very good. Phumzile had just been named as the Executive Director of UN Women. And so she's based in New York, and she's in charge of the global UN Women entity. And we were really, really thrilled and chuffed that she chose her very first international visit to come to Australia. So I was on the board of UN Women at the time, and Australia has always been considered a great supporter of UN Women, and the government has been a good contributor, a good donor. So she came to Australia and I interviewed her, and this photo was taken at that time at ANU, where we did a big public forum. And the reason I show this is because I, again, as a journalist, was very excited to talk to her about the 20th anniversary of this great blueprint for gender equality. What are we going to do? How are we going to celebrate the 20th anniversary? And normally, for a UN document such as this, every 5 years it would be reviewed and updated. So here she was sitting in front of an audience of 300 people, and she said to me at this moment, oh no, Virginia, we won't be reviewing the document. We won't be opening the document. We're not going down that path. And when I said, well, why? And she said, and explained in a way that actually made many in the audience gasp. She said, the backlash against gender equality and what we are trying to do with the declaration and the platform for action is so great that if we open it for review, a lot of the rights that were given to women back in 1995, will be taken away. So a lot of the growing populist movements around the world and fundamentalist nations will wind back rights that they gave women and girls back in 1995. So we won't open it up for review. That was a really shocking, disturbing thing to hear. So let's wind forward to this year, 2020, which is now the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, as I said, the greatest blueprint for gender equality for the world ever written. This year, we're trying to be tougher about it. Yes, the document has been opened. Unfortunately, the discussion conference, what we call the Commission on the Status of Women, was to be held in March. And as you know, the lockdown, the pandemic was announced, and the lockdown occurred. And on around the 5th or 6th of March, the United Nations decided they would cancel that conference. So it wasn't held. However, I'm glad to say that my organisation hastily put together an Australian version of that very conference. But jumping forward, one of the things that was to be launched at that time was the Gender Equality Campaign that I referred to earlier. In the lead up to the Gender Equality Campaign run by the United Nations, in 2015, the UN Women launched a campaign called He for She. And one of the global ambassadors for that campaign was Emma Watson. Now, me being someone who knows nothing about popular culture, when I was on the board at the time, and when they said to me we're going to bring Emma Watson in to be the face of this campaign, I was the dummy who said, who's she? I was not very happy about the idea of using celebrities to face our campaigns. I thought it should be fronted by real people. However, I was very, very wrong. How wrong I was. It turned out she became a brilliant ambassador for the He for She campaign. The He for She campaign is all about calling out to men as well as women to understand gender equality is a project for all of us. Now, one of the things that Emma Watson did brilliantly was she addressed the United Nations, the General Assembly, which was an extraordinary speech. You can find it on YouTube. It's 13 minutes long. It's really worth listening to all of it. I'm going to play you a couple of minutes of it right now with subtitles. But one of the things she addressed, which went beyond what we had expected, was she wanted to talk about the elephant in the room, which is men. And the fear of many men that gender equality not only is not about them, but that they can't participate, and that somehow men are the enemy in all of this. And she said that is nonsense. And rather than not talk about it, let's hit it hard. Let's go straight to it. So here is what she said about that particular issue. Please have a listen.
I was appointed 6 months ago. And the more I've spoken about feminism, the more I realized that fighting for women's rights has too often become synonymous with man-hating. If there is one thing I know for certain, it is that this has to stop. For the record, feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities. It is the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. I started questioning gender-based assumptions a long time ago. When I was 8, I was confused at being called bossy, because I wanted to direct the plays that we would put on for our parents. But the boys were not. When at 14, I started to be sexualized by certain elements of the media. When at 15, my girlfriends started dropping out of their beloved sports teams because they didn't want to appear muscly. When at 18, my male friends were unable to express their feelings. I decided that I was a feminist. And this seemed uncomplicated to me. But my recent research has shown me that feminism has become an unpopular word. Women are choosing not to identify as feminists. Apparently, I am among the ranks of women whose expressions are seen as too strong, too aggressive, isolating, and anti-men, unattractive even. Why has the word become such an uncomfortable one? I am from Britain, and I think it is right that I am paid the same as my male counterparts. I think it is right that I should be able to make decisions about my own body. I think it is right that women be involved on my behalf in the policies and the decisions that will affect my life. I think it is right that socially I am afforded the same respect as men. But sadly, I can say that there is no one country in the world where all women can expect to receive these rights. No country in the world can yet say that they have achieved gender equality. Thank you very, very much.
Emma Watson. Now, I think there'll be a lot of women sitting there thinking, bossy, too strong. We've all heard that. So that was 2015. And jumping forward, UN Women and the United Nations then, for the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, have come up with this campaign, as I said, generation equality. I've been referring to it as gender equality, generation equality. The idea being that it is this generation right now that has the opportunity to really crack through and make a difference. And if we don't, if this generation doesn't, possibly we never will. The global stats on gender equality are appalling, and I'll come to those shortly. But right at the moment, we are looking at 257 years before we achieve economic equality between men and women. That's if we don't act now. So I'm going to play you just one more video here, which is about generation equality. It gives a sense, it goes around the world, but it does give a sense of activity and action and momentum building right around the world. So have a listen to this. It's short.
What defines a generation? Is it just about the year you were born? Or is there something more? We may have lived through different decades, different circumstances, different countries, but we all share in the global, everyday push for our rights, for justice, for a world that is equal. Perhaps what defines our generation isn't our age or our background, but the line in the sand that we have drawn. We take to the streets to speak out against discrimination, and we work tirelessly behind the scenes. We stand up for peace.
We are fed up with the war
and economic justice. We start with a statement and watch it become a movement. We have come a long way, but the fight isn't over, and our rights are still under assault. It is time to take action. Let us be the wake-up call the world needs.
The eyes of all future generations are upon you.
Be the first, the youngest, the best, and then make sure no one is left behind. When someone tries to silence you, raise up your voice.
Let us wage a global struggle.
Change everything, or change just one thing. As long as you do something, whether you're new to changing the world or have been in the fight for a long time.
He knows exactly why we are here.
We are all together, united for gender equality. And the future we create for women and girls is up to all of us.
So, how are we faring around the world if we look at the position and the progress of women? Well, not well. At the moment, the World Economic Forum, which releases a gender gap report every year, at the moment they're saying it will take 99.5, nearly 100 years to close the overall gender gap. In our region, 163 years. Our region being East Asia and Pacific. These are terrible numbers. This means that if we go on only doing what we're doing now, not only ourselves and our daughters and sons and their grandchildren, but possibly the following generation will not experience gender equality, and girls and women will not experience their the rights to participate in life until the year 163 years from now. This is terrible. Obviously, it's untenable. But the data doesn't lie. On the data, as I said, the World Economic Forum produces this report every year. At the moment, this is what it's telling us. Of 153 nations around the world, there are 13 heads of state. Now, right at the moment, during this terrible pandemic, if you're following the news about which countries are doing well, you would know the names of probably 6 of those nations, that are 13 are headed by women, but at least 6 or 7 of them, because they're considered to be the nations handling the coronavirus better than anyone else. Interesting. Only about 1 in 5 ministers around the world are female, 25% of parliamentarians, and 34% of managerial positions around the world held by women. As I said, going back to 1995, when the declaration, that gender equality blueprint, was first drawn up, we didn't expect these figures to be this low all this time later. So how's Australia doing? Well, in 2006, when the report first started, the Global Gender Gap Index, I was a journalist and I was appalled when we came in at 15 in the world. I remember thinking, gosh, we should be doing much better than that. We're a rich country. We have very high levels of education, equality, etc. Australia should be, number 1. We came in at 15. Every year since 2006, Australia has fallen down the ranks, and currently in 2020, we sit at 44 out of 153 nations for gender equality. For a rich, safe, well-educated nation, that is shocking and it's shameful. We sit at number 1 in the world for education. So there are 4 main criteria the World Economic Forum looks at when it comes to rounding off this index. Education being one, obviously. We sit at number 1. We've had more women, more females graduate with bachelor degrees or above than men since 1995. So Australian men are more formally educated than men. I beg your pardon, Australian females are more formally educated than males and have been since 95. So education's not the problem. We have wonderful equality of education. In fact, we're the envy of the world. Look at us, number 1 for education. But then you look at our economic participation and opportunity, economic security for women, and we sit at 49 in the world. For a wealthy nation, that's extraordinary. But political empowerment, even worse. We sit at 57 in the world. This is out of 153 nations. And the Interparliamentary Union puts us at 51 in the world for the number of women we have in Parliament. These are terrible figures. So bringing the big picture back home, in 2011, Australia hosted CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And we held the big conference of CHOGM in Perth when the Queen comes and 53 Commonwealth nations, the prime ministers of all those nations come to one country. And Australia was host, and the Prime Minister at the time was Julia Gillard, our Governor-General, Dame Clinton Bryce, and the Prime Minister invited me to facilitate a discussion on women's leadership on the outskirts of the CHOGM event. Interestingly, the first thing I was asked was to make sure that the panel, so one of the things we were doing was having a panel discussion over dinner, and she said, we want to have all leaders or female leaders on stage discussing women and leadership and women's empowerment. The problem was, out of the 53 Commonwealth nations, as I pointed out, only 3 of them had female leaders. So that wasn't enough for our panel. So we had to bring in a few female ministers, and we also included the head of our Baroness Catherine Ashton, who was the head of the UN Security Council at the time. And we had a fantastic discussion. But one of the things that came up was, how do we model leadership, not only around the world, but in Australia? Now, it's pretty clear that Australia for a long time has had a very male model of leadership. You don't need me to point this out to you, and it's all pretty obvious. But when we've had so few women in positions of leadership, public leadership, and certainly few women in key decision-making roles in our public life for decades, forever really, it's no wonder that our model of leadership, when we think of a leader, we tend to think of men. We tend to think of prime ministers we know, or governor-generals, or heads of high court, or police commissioners, or heads of defence, etc. Some of those men are fantastic believers in gender equality, and indeed doing their best to advance the progress of women in Australia. Some think differently. Some bring a different attitude to the capabilities of women to be leaders and to occupy key roles of decision-making and to be heads of government. And one of those, of course, was our former Prime Minister, who at times I had to have quite a few discussions with. Moving on, though, to the data, which is something that I'm particularly concerned about, and as the founder of the 50/50 by 2030 Foundation, it is data that we collect and that we analyse, among other things. WGEA, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, is the government's own agency to look at gender equality across all private sector industries. It doesn't look at the public sector, the private sector, and those with over 100 employees. So it's not the whole workforce, but it is a huge chunk of the workforce. They have been collating data to give us the details of the gender pay gap for several years now. And as you can see there, the current 2020 gender pay gap is $25,000 or $26,000 a year. Now, what that means, just to be clear, because people get quite confused about this, is that it doesn't mean that you might be doing a job and someone else in your office, you're male and she's female, and you're doing the same job and you actually get the same pay and you're on the same rate. And that's why people say, oh, but that's ridiculous. The gender pay gap doesn't exist in our workplace. What the gender pay gap is it takes the whole Australian workforce, or this particular figure, all full-time workers, their total remuneration over a year. Look at the men's, look at the women's. The average comes out at $25,700 less for the average woman. And that pay gap is actually 20.8, nearly 21%. If we move on to looking at industries now, just drilling down, what does this actually mean? Bringing up this slide for myself here, excuse me. So when we look at the overall industry, all Australian industries, WGEA breaks Australian workforce into 19 industries. And overall, as you can see there, the majority of workers across the 19 industries are women. It's very close to half and half, but just women just tip over the 50% mark. Interestingly, of the 19 industries, 6 that sit at the bottom for the lowest pay are all dominated by women. You guessed it. A lot of them in the healthcare, in caring, education, etc. If we just move on then to have a look at your own industry, which is highlighted there, which is transport, and you'll see that the pay gap in your industry in transport is quite high, over 18%, nearly 19%. So that means across your industry, not your workplace, but your industry, looking at full-time workers, men and women, it means that men are taking home every dollar. For every dollar that men take home, women are taking home 81 cents. Doesn't seem fair to me, does it? Now, looking at your own industry more directly, I was really, really impressed to read the gender diversity report that ARA has done. This is a very sophisticated analysis of what is going on among ARA members. And I'm only highlighting this now because I'm assuming you've all seen it or you know about it. It's on the website. If you haven't seen it, go have a look at it because it's actually very, very good. And I look at a lot of these reports. It's very, very good. But it tells you a little bit about your own industry. One thing I would point out, though, as the authors of the report have, only 28% of ARA members responded to this survey. Therefore, it's not necessarily indicative of the whole industry. The numbers are interesting, but what it's telling us about those that responded. So for the 72%, sorry, I beg your pardon, the 72% of ARA members that didn't respond, I wonder why. So what the respondents did tell us, though, is that 1 in 4 workers in your workforce are female. A very high percentage of those are part-time workers. The problem with part-time work, of course, is precarious. It means women have less super. It means they earn less, of course. It's precarious and it's often the first to go when there is some kind of recession or tightening or austerity measures. So I don't like the fact that so many Australian women are in part-time work. In fact, Australia has a really high rate of women working part-time, and the highest in the OECD. What was also interesting in this is though there has been quite a significant and very healthy increase in recruitment of females in your direct industry, in your workplaces, only 28% are actually getting promoted. Which is disappointing to see. So moving away from your industry now and just to Australia generally. The Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins, when she took on that role in 2017, we asked her to come and speak at the Press Club on International Women's Day, the 8th of March, which of course she did. And one of the things she talked about that really rammed home a message for me was about the discrepancy between what we think about gender equality and what we actually do. So what we think and say and what our actions are. And as you can see in this comment she's made, there's a real difference between what men think and what women think. And she says that incorrect assumptions are being made about the progress of gender equality in Australia and internationally. We actually assume we're doing a lot better than we are. Now, this really rang true for me. I had just set up the 50/50 by 2030 foundation. I'd left the media to move to the University of Canberra and do this. And it really rang true with me that what people say and what they actually do, what they really think is quite different. So we set out to do some research of our own, looking at the attitudes of Australians to gender equality. It was a very big national survey, and I won't give you all the details. It's on our website. But just very briefly, we found the really high proportion of Australians, 88%, believe that gender equality is still a problem. Women believe that men and women do not have the same access to career opportunities. I found that particularly distressing and disappointing. But this is particularly interesting. High proportion of men, about a third of men surveyed, and it was a national survey, saying that they actually think that it's important to maintain traditional gender roles so that families function well. Well, that's a problem because traditional gender roles have not served women well. Traditional gender roles alone have not enabled women to be independent, autonomous, to really reach their potential, and to move well beyond family. And also, traditional gender roles have actually segregated the home roles, the domestic roles and family roles, such that men haven't been able to participate as much as they should. So this is a worrying figure. We found a lot of really interesting figures around, or data around, attitudes towards leadership, particularly among millennials, those 26 to 30, or 23 to 36, I think they are. Millennial men, a really high rate, millennial men that demonstrated they actually do think that men are better at leadership than women. Now, that's a problem. Not only is it a problem, but that is going to impact Australia moving forward if we don't actually talk about this, tackle it, and unpack it. Now, why do we need men and women equally sharing leadership? It is obvious, but I'll state it anyway. The greater the diversity of people you bring around the decision-making table, the more diverse the ideas you get, the greater potential for creative responses to challenging challenging problems. And let's face it, we have some pretty big challenges ahead. If we really want to crack open some disruption, take some risks in ways that actually mean we can advance in a creative, thoughtful way for our businesses, our research, our opportunities to progress our nation, we have to diversify the way we think. And the way to do that is to bring men and women together in equal numbers. When we have a lot of men around the decision-making table and few women, we're just doing what we've always done. And the time has come to move beyond that. So moving on to this now, one of the things that disturbed me again in our research, the very high rate of men, over 50%, so 54%, who believe that somehow political correctness is stifling their ability to speak out. That is something that we need to talk more broadly about. Now, I'm going to just jump forward because I really want to be able to take your questions. But one of the issues that we must talk about when we talk about gender equality is the incredible impact of violence against women. Now, here we have Michelle Bachelet. She was the very first executive director of UN Women. She's currently the president of Chile. But she took on this role and travelled the world, and she also came to Australia. She actually had was an asylum seeker in Australia many, many years ago. She's Argentinian. I beg your pardon, she's Chilean, I should say. She's Chilean. But during a certain period in which it was politically dangerous for her and her family, she took asylum in Australia. So she's close to Australia, but when she came here and she spoke about the violence against women, this rang really true for Australia. Our stats on violence against women are gobsmacking. You know them, so I won't harp on about this, but you know that at the moment in Australia, on average, one woman is being murdered a week by her partner or an intimate or former intimate partner. Now, there's a whole lot I could say about this, but we haven't got time. But if you're interested in this sort of material and data, have a look at Our Watch. They have some excellent materials. But the fact that violence against women in Australia, and it's not just murdering, it's not just the homicides, it's also the abuse of women. It's violence against women at home by partners can include yelling and screaming. It can include isolating women. It can include keeping money and resources from women. Violence is actually a very broad crime, and it is rife in Australia. And we believe that at the core of violence is disrespect for women. Not all disrespect for women eventuates in violence, but certainly violence starts with the disrespect of women. Another reason that it's so important to talk about gender equality. In Australia, various groups have tried to really take this issue in hand. In 2016, the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull held the first national summit on reducing violence against women, which I was asked to facilitate. All the premiers came, the Prime Minister was there. We spent a day talking in groups, as you can see there, Rosie Batty, various premiers, Daniel Andrews there, some fantastic discussions. It was done again in 2019 last year. What worries me is that we keep having the same conversation. And the data is showing that it's not making a difference. That really worries me. So for those of you, I'm raising all of these big issues. For those of you who are thinking, gender equality, we're done and dusted with that. I hope by now you're getting the sense that, in fact, we're not. So on to the issue of respect. As I said, I left media and my career at the ABC at the time to go to the University of Canberra and set up the 50/50 by 2030 Foundation, which I'm now the chair of. And I'll just share with you a little video that we made back in 2017 when we launched the foundation, which was about the aspirations that we have and why we did it. So just have a quick listen to this short video. Momentum for change is in the air, and it's time to shift up a gear. The 50/50 Foundation is an idea whose time has come. Now, our vision is very simple and straightforward. By the year 2030, men and women will be equally represented in leadership and key decision-making roles at all levels of government and public administration throughout Australia and across our region.
I look out to this gathering and feel a stirring confidence in what can be achieved, along with the energy and the will to achieve it. Increasing the representation of women in public leadership and key decision-making is not about fairness, nor is it just about equity economics, even though we know that the business case for having more women in leadership is irrefutable. Increasing the rate and representation of women is about future-proofing our nation.
We're long overdue, and that's what this foundation is about, for institutions that reflect and represent our diversity and difference and equally represent men and women. Change takes time. But thank you for giving us a goal. Thank you for giving us a target. But let's not be afraid to beat that goal and beat that target, because women of Australia, in fact, women of our region and the world, deserve no less.
That's 10 years from now, we want to see men and women equally sharing leadership and key decision-making roles across Australia and across our region. Will we beat that target? I don't know. I hope so. I hope so, because I want to turn off the light of my office then and say, that's it, job done, going home now, I'm going to retire. We have a long way to go. But let's bring it back to you just before I finish and take some questions. What can you do? What can you do yourself, among your peers, your family? Well, look, I'm going to give you three really, really quick things. What you can do in your own domestic world, what you can do in your social world, and what you can do in your workplace. Let's take the domestic world first, your home. And I know many of you are probably there right now. Have these conversations at home. Have conversations about who does what and why. And it's not just about he does the gardening and I do the cooking. I'm not talking about that. But who does what and why? How do you share the unpaid work? How do you share the unpaid care? And the reason I say it's important to ask these questions is because the data tells us now that women still, right now, this year, do the lion's share of unpaid work at home. And this has been highlighted, of course, as we're all in lockdown. But have these conversations, not just about who does what, it's not about having an argument, but then question, why do we do it like that? Why is that necessary? And what are the implications? Who misses out on something because that's what we do, this is the arrangement we make? For many people, I know it's around money too. Someone earns more, so someone does more at home. And that's perfectly reasonable, as long as we're having the discussion and understanding the implications for the person who is at the other end of that, at the domestic side of that, doing a lot of the unpaid work, then needs to be valued in a way that we perhaps don't value them now. And I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking, but he's suddenly gone nuts. The postman's arrived. Domestic. So the domestic world, let's have a look at the social world. With your peers, your friends, have these discussions. Be mindful of when you are in a group, who dominates? Do you ever go to barbecues and find when you're sitting around a table that some people do a lot more talking than others, and for a lot of people it can be a bloke? Now, I hang out with a lot of journalists and politicians, and believe me, the blokes do a lot of talking. Ask yourself why that happens and point it out to people with respect. Invite those who are somehow lost in those conversations to be part of it. The idea here is that we need to share a sense of being valued and share the power. I'm asking you to really speak to your partners and your families about valuing everyone for what they bring to a situation, or what they bring to the family, or what they might bring to the wider community, in a way that takes into account differences and valuing those differences. And then in your workplace, I'm going to ask you to consider some of the things that I have said today and have a look at your own workplace and where you can identify problems. And I challenge you, I don't think anyone listening to this could tell me they cannot see any gender inequity in their workplace. I don't believe one of you could say that. So I challenge you to have a look around you at your workplace and see where there might be something that you actually can do, or an issue you can raise, discuss, that might make a difference. As was said in the Generation Equality video, your challenge is either do everything or do one thing, but just don't do nothing. If we do nothing, the standard that you allow to happen in front of you as a bystander is the standard you accept. If we do nothing, it still will be 99.5 years before we achieve gender equality. It will be over 160 years before we achieve it in this region. And it will be over 250 years, 257, before we achieve economic equality for men and women. If we don't do something, and everyone can do something. Even if it is just promising yourself that you will no longer be a bystander. You will raise the issues that you see in a respectful and a useful, collaborative way and challenge them. Look at better ways so that everyone, men and women, can equally participate and their participation be valued. And on that note, I think I should stop because we are absolutely running out of time. The last slide there is broader gender. Broader gender is, it's a media site that I set up. We're about to launch a brand new website in 2 months, in mid-July. So have a look at it now, subscribe, but by mid-July you'll see that it's going to be a lot more interactive and have a lot more information for you if you're interested. And my Twitter handle there, Virginia_House, if you want to chat to me. Feel free, if I can't answer your questions today, I would love to hear them. You can always send me an email at virginia.haussegger@canberra.edu.au, and I'd be very happy to personally respond to your questions. Give me time to get around to it, but I'd be really happy to hear from you. So I'll throw it back now to Natalie.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Wow, that was just packed full of information. So many questions are coming through, and I loved at the end how you provided some really practical actions for us. So often we wait for leaders of countries or leaders in our organisations, or that's the HR manager's job, to sort out diversity, but we all have a role to play. So I'm so pleased that you gave us some practical actions there at the end. One question I wanted to kick us off with is there is so much information in terms of the benefits of gender equality, and yet we haven't moved past the rhetoric into the action. What do you think when we've got the research and the analysis there to actually say we could do things better, why hasn't that led into action?
Look, it's a really good question. Are we going to get cut off in 4 minutes, or can I just keep talking?
No, can we buy more time? Can I steal more minutes? Is that all right? It's okay with Redback if it's okay with you.
Oh no, I'm absolutely fine.
Wonderful,
but and I won't go on too long. But look, in answer to your question, it's a really interesting one because there are times when I get really quite a bit depressed about gender equality. In fact, I'm working on a book at the moment on rage and anger about what we haven't achieved. But of course, that has made me go back and have a really hard look at what has been achieved over the last 30 years. As I said, I started getting quite active, even as a journalist, back in the 80s around the issue of gender equality. And look, as I say, progress is too slow. And the figures show, as I've just keep pointing out, if we don't act seriously now, we are generations away from achieving gender equality, which is really bad for the men around us. It's bad for our sons. It's bad for the men we love. I mean, it's just crazy. And it's bad for women, all of us. are restricted and are not being allowed to fully be who we are, with all the myriad differences that we have, whilst we stick to old notions of gender and gender norms. But I need now to be, well, I want to be a little bit encouraging. We have made some progress in some areas, and the data is showing that. For example, when I first started looking at leadership in the public sector, I was part of a group that started back in 2010-11 looking at leadership in the Australian public service, and the figures were terrible. So we did a lot of work around that. We did a report called Not Yet 50/50, which was launched in 2013, 2014. The figures have improved. We've worked really hard at getting departments to adopt gender equality strategies. They have. Then there was a national strategy for the Australian public service launched in 2016, and targets set, and most importantly, heads of departments, it became their KPI to meet some of those targets, which is a really important point. And so, numbers started to improve. The problem is, it's not just about numbers. It's about the story behind the numbers. And as we've been trying to unpack, the attitudes and perceptions. We can all go to our gender equality training at work. We can say we've got a gender equality strategy and policy and we tick it off. But if we at heart don't really believe that this matters and don't really want to see it happening, all we're doing is going through the motions. And what we're experiencing right now in 2020, and we are going to continue in the 2020s, is the very thing that Pumzile Mlambo-Nyaka was talking about when she came here in 2014, the backlash. If in 1995 they could draw up, the world could draw up a gender equality strategy that set targets to fully support women and girls, that she said, if we open that document, it's going to be wound back, because a number of countries, fundamentalist countries in particular, have already indicated they want to wind back those freedoms, particularly freedoms, interestingly, around women's sexual rights, reproductive rights, and around their bodies, around property rights, travel rights, autonomy. So, nations wanting to wind back women's freedom, individuality, and autonomy. That is a real problem. But in Australia, we are seeing backlash because we have seen progress. With progress, you always get someone unhappy, someone loses out, and there will be backlash. The task for us all now is to manage that carefully and with really careful consideration about impacts for both men and women.
So many questions have come up as a result of what you just said. So a couple I want to touch on. One is around your view of targets and the importance of them. And the second bit is around tailoring programs for females, and it's seen at the expense of men. So there's a lot of support and initiative to support leadership for women in organisations, and men feel like they're getting disadvantaged. So whether you could touch on both of those points?
Yeah, no, they're both really, really important points, and I'll try to be fairly quick on this. Let's take the first one, targets, quotas. I am all for quotas. Quotas work. Quotas work. We know this when we look around the world, that all those nations that have improved their representation of women in their parliaments, in their ministries and in their cabinets, they all, 118 of them, have some form of gender quota. Now, the reason we need quotas, it's complicated, but I'll try to keep this fairly simple. Women are starting at a disadvantage when it comes to the workplace, whether it's getting into politics or whether it's getting a good job, or whether it's even getting a job. Women are starting at a disadvantage and always have. Even though we're in Australia, for example, we're more educated, we're starting at a disadvantage. The playing field has not been level. It never has been in Australia or anywhere in the world. Don't forget, there's no nation in the world that has achieved gender equality. So to actually to create an even playing field, we need to bring more women into all of the roles around us. We need to give women an affirmative boost up, and quotas do that. And now for those who say, oh, but we don't want, I've actually had women say this to me, oh, but I don't want to be a token woman. And I'm thinking, really? You look around the current parliament, you look around the current cabinet, the shadow cabinet, and you tell me there aren't token men in there because of factional deals, because of party deals. I mean, really, you show me the top 200 ASX companies in this nation that don't have token men on their boards, men who are there simply because they were mates of so-and-so and so-and-so. I know it. I've sat on a number of boards, and when a board position comes up, the first thing we all do is talk about the people we know that we might bring in. Women do it too. I do it. That is human nature. So to actually cut through, we have to instill quotas that give women an opportunity such that they get the step up that they need. It doesn't mean they're token. It doesn't mean they're lesser. It is just saying we have to somehow even the playing field, because it's not even. It's never been even. And I'll give you another quick example. Governor-General of Australia. So since 1901, we've had a Governor-General every year. The first time we got a female, I think she was the 27th Governor-General, was Quentin Bryce in 2008. I might be wrong about that, but 2008 I think it was. Now, she was incredibly well qualified for that role. She'd been Federal Sex Discrimination Commissioner. She's a lawyer. She'd been all sorts of things. Incredibly qualified, formally and socially, culturally as well for that role. Wonderful diplomat. And she is one of many, many women who could do that role. And yet as soon as her time was up, the Prime Minister then that was in place when appointing the most recent Governor-General said he appointed, we had a military man, and then he appointed another military man and said there was no one else. I didn't look anywhere else. There was no one else. He was the only one. Now, the current Governor-General is a wonderful man, and I admire him greatly, and he's a great champion of gender equality, I've got to say. But nevertheless, that is nonsense to say there was no one else. Why don't we set a quota of every second time a Governor-General is appointed, we have a woman? So every other one, we have a man, we have a woman, we have a man. Why not? We have the women with the qualities, the attributes, and the qualifications to take on those roles. Among the last 4 Governor-Generals, 3 of them have been military men. It's not necessary. So, I'm a big fan of quotas because I say enough is enough. And I don't want to wait until 257 years from now until we achieve things such as economic equality. So quotas, it's time. They work. We know that. Tokenism, I can point out many, 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 many token men for sure. The other question, sorry, what was the other question?
It was in terms of programs that are specialised to encourage women in the workforce in terms of leadership, but men don't have those same opportunities. So.
Yeah. Okay. And look, I run these myself. I design them. I do various women leadership courses, presentation for women's courses. Now, it's a really interesting one. The reason we do this for women, again, as I say, because women are coming at it from a disadvantage anyway. One of the things that I find most important when I run courses specifically for women enjoy the company of women, feel safer, tend to be more open, particularly if you're doing a presentation course, for example, or leadership course, tend to be more open. It is a safe space for women, but also, as I pointed out in some of those slides earlier, our model of leadership, for example, in Australia is very, very male-oriented. When you close your eyes and I say, think of a leader, you'll think of many, and most of them will be men. I've done this experiment many times with students at universities and say, give me your top 5 leaders. They always name men. although it's changing a little bit now. Jacinda Ardern comes up often, and Julie Gillard. But because the models under which we work are very male-oriented. The workplace in Australia was designed by men for men, and for a worker who was autonomous and independent and free of family responsibilities. That's the model. That's the workplace model. So what we've done in bringing women into the workplace in particular in big numbers, we've asked them to try and fit in, to try and mould themselves in some way, just to fit in. We haven't really radically changed the workplace, all the workplace culture. So providing courses for women in particular is one way I find of actually saying to women, no, you don't need to fix yourself. You are terrific. The contribution you bring through your own different life experience, your different outlook, the fact that you might have been home being a mother for many years, you're a great multitasker, you see things differently. These are things to be valued, highly valued, and I don't want to knock them out of you. I actually want to help you see those things yourself and promote those things in yourself. Bring your diversity into the workplace. Don't try and change yourself to fit the workplace. I hope that helps answer that.
Yeah, absolutely. And a follow-on question to that is there's a lot of specialised recruitment or support, a proportion of female apprenticeships that can come particularly into gender inequality industries such as rail. But we're finding that there's not the same number of applicants. So we have all these spots and females are not applying. What is the reluctancy and what can we do to encourage that? Is it literally just about promoting ourselves as more female friendly?
It's another really, really great question. And interestingly, this is a question that comes up with a number of industries, but it's really pertinent to your industry in particular, because you do have such a dominance of male workers. If we look at 1 in 4 that you found in your own survey. Look, what it really is it comes back to attitudes and perceptions. What is appropriate for women and girls and young women? What is considered okay for them to do? These are nationwide challenges that we need to tackle, which is why we need to have a big national discussion about gender equality. And as Emma Watson said, the actress in that video, when she was young and her own friends at 14 they stopped playing their beloved sports because they didn't want to look muscly, because that wasn't good for girls to look muscly. See, this is all around perceptions and attitudes as to what's appropriate for girls and women, what's appropriate for men and boys. They're the things we really need to smash. So it does come back to helping change attitudes by actually showing by example. Tell stories. Find women and men doing those roles to tell their stories, to share their stories. That's a really powerful way of engaging, particularly young women, to come on board. But I also, both things, telling stories and showing by example, but also ensuring that young men and women understand that this is not only just female friendly, but it's a progressive place that treats gender equality with respect. Gender equality, when you think about it, there's a spectrum, like a sexuality spectrum, I suppose, and we all move up and down it a little bit. At times I am very, very bossy. I'm very annoying. I'm all those sorts of things my male bosses have always been. And at other times I can be very feminine. My husband, for example, is one of the world's greatest criers. You go to a film, I always have to have extra tissues. He cries at everything. He cries at bloody ads about pets. So we move up and down that spectrum a lot. We need to encourage everyone in our workplace to do that. And in your instance, I think the reality is some jobs in your industry are quite possibly, and I don't know this for sure, but quite possibly very physical. That doesn't mean that women can't participate and can't do them. But would they want to? Well, unless they know that other women are doing them and doing them successfully and enjoying them, it's hard to make that leap. I know in other industries, in mining, they've been really, really good at showcasing women. In the defence forces, really good in some defence forces more than others in showcasing women doing things that once upon a time they didn't do. So it's it's by example, but also making it clear that you are a progressive industry and sector when it comes to considering gender equality, which is about all of us.
Yeah. I'm going to have to wrap this up really quickly, but I want to squeeze a few more questions in, but I could talk to you all day. So another question was this, Emma raised it in terms of feminist being a dirty word. So, and I think the question here by someone who's touched it in was that Julie Bishop famously said that she's not a feminist. So it's seen as a threatening word to men, but I've also heard men say that they're feminists. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about the use of that term and the pros and cons around it?
It's a really interesting one. So Julie Bishop did say that, and I actually asked her the question. It was at the press club here.
All right, so you can speak on it.
But and I was very disappointed that she wouldn't take on the term. Interestingly, the then Minister for Women was Senator Michaelia Cash, who was also on stage at the time, and she wouldn't take on the term either and never has. I disagree. I'm very, very proud to call myself a feminist, but quite frankly, I don't care if others don't. It's really the principle behind it. I think that even those women who insist they aren't feminists because somehow they see it as being, as separating themselves from men, which couldn't be further from the truth. I love men. God, I keep marrying them. Look, I think, if they're really uncomfortable with the term, fine, and don't use it if you don't want to. I think that's pretty daft and a bit old-fashioned, but nevertheless. But even those women who won't take on that title, and I'm talking about Julie Bishop, for example, and Senator Michaelia Cash, who is, he's a great believer in all the basic tenets of feminism. You sit down with her and she's fantastic to talk to, as is Bishop, about all these issues, about advancing women's right to be operating at every level of government, to be moving in, a lot more forcefully into leadership positions. Interestingly, though, that government would never institute quotas, and we talked a lot about that, but Senator Cash was very, very anti-quotas. But they still believe in the basic tenets of feminism. And, I think, you'll find that many of those girls right now who've got some stupid kind of social media understanding of what it means to be a feminist, and that there is something about being anti-male. And now look, it's wrong, it's nonsense, that's not what feminism is. Either educate yourself and read up about it, or else just understand that it is in fact feminism is a very broad church, very broad indeed. But look, let's not get bogged down about a word. It's a word. I will always call myself a feminist. People don't want to, fine.
Sure. And maybe finally, to wrap it up, what are those countries, organisations, workplaces, industries that are doing well in progressing or moving towards gender equality? What are some standout things that they're doing that the rail industry or individually we should adopt in our workplace?
Yeah, no, really good question. I could talk about this all day too. All right, well, I won't, but we just go to the nations that do the best on the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index every year. It's the same kind of nations. They're the Nordic countries. New Zealand's up there all the time. New Zealand currently sits at number 6 or 7 in the world. But the Nordic countries in particular, and I'll go straight to Finland. Finland, and it's a very small nation, so perhaps it's easier in terms of policy. But Finland has a prime minister who is 37. She's just had a baby, her first child. She governs Finland under a coalition. There are 5 political parties in that coalition. Imagine that, 5. They're all headed by women. And out of those 5 leaders, women, 3 of them are in their 30s. Now, that's pretty radical, right, in terms of women leadership. Now, one of my research fellows is Finnish, and she was actually in Finland when the current Prime Minister was elected. And so we talk about this a real lot. And I find myself saying to her all the time, Pia, how do they do it? Why do they do it? or how do they manage it? One of the key, and there are many things that they do from a policy perspective, but one of the key things that makes a really big difference in a nation like that is their shared care mentality. So the caring of children and the caring of family is utterly shared. They don't look at it as a male-female mother versus father thing at all. They have very generous parental leave schemes, paid schemes for up to a year. In Australia, we have 18 weeks, which is one of the worst in the world, although the United States has none, no national scheme. But they have paid parental leave. So some women, like the current Prime Minister, has her baby, stays at home for 6 weeks, and then hands it over, and her husband or partner is in taking the rest of the year off to look after the baby. This is standard. It's quite common. And not only does it mean a woman can continue to advance her career or work, or just some women don't even like being at home with little kids. They prefer work. Some men like being at home with little kids, quite the opposite. So, but not only does it allow that, and it allows men to be a lot more engaged in children right from the outset, and therefore be really, a much greater parent as a result going forward as children age. The other thing they do is a shorter work day. They finish work at 4 o'clock. They have shorter work weeks, which mean there is a lot more time for family time, and it is shared time. They're a lot more realistic about not doing work outside of work hours. And it doesn't mean that they're less productive, by the way. So there's a whole lot of really interesting work practices there that I think that we should be considering. And certainly, as we snap forward post-COVID, whenever that might be, these are the sorts of things we need to be looking at in Australia.
Absolutely, absolutely. We are so over time, but this has just been wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentation and all your extra bits of information with Q&A. Thank you for those participants that joined us today and engaged in Q&A online. There will be a short feedback survey that will be circulated to all participants, so I encourage you to fill it out. Just a reminder, as I said, the presentation today has been recorded and will also be forwarded on. This is one of many great lineup of speakers that we have at the ARA on our webinar series. So please register for upcoming webinars. Next Wednesday, we have Polly McGee. She's back. First installment of the 3-part Dare to Lead series. Definitely not to be missed. But thanks again, Virginia, and thanks again to all our participants who joined us today. Stay safe. Catch you next time.
Bye. Thank you.